guys, welcome back. In today's tutorial, I'll be showing you how to paint these lovely green fields with some distant cloudy mountains. This is a very simple and beginner-friendly tutorial. And if you like to paint this, do grab your brushes and join me. So let's start off with some of the materials. In terms of paints, you can see that this landscape we have a variety of greens, and let's start with the highlights. So I like to have a little bit of warmer colors from the sun shining through, and with that I'll be adding some yellow. Here I'll be using primary yellow from Senolia. This gives a very bright, warm feeling to the entire landscape. And then next, we'll be adding in a bit of the dirty yellow, which is brown pink from Senolia. This will also give a bit of muddy feeling into the landscape. And the third color I'll be adding in is a very light green, which is phthalo green light from Senolia. And for the fourth green, the majority of the greens here will be used based on this color. And the one that I'm using is sap green from Winsor & Newton. And for the last green, this is a darker green which will be used in the shadow areas, is greenish umber, also from Senolia. And then for the browns, we will have sepia, which is a darker brown. This is a color that I'll be mixing in with the greenish umber to give a variety of hue in the shadows. And the final color we'll be using is neutral tint. And in terms of brushes, we'll need two brushes. First, we need a round brush, or otherwise you can use a mop brush if you have one. This will be used in applying the colors. And the second brush that we will need on hand is a synthetic brush, and this one will be used as a blending brush. And to bring back some of the highlights towards the end of the painting, I'll be using a white ink pen to bring back the highlights. And we will also need a spray bottle. And this is a reference picture that we'll be using for today. If you're interested, I'll have it in the description below. And to start off, I'll be sketching out the lines of the landscape. While doing this, be sure to keep the lines slightly crooked. It doesn't have to be perfect straight lines, because that will help to make it look more natural. And then here we have a little river flowing through. And that's all for our simple sketch. We will dive in and start painting now. Grabbing the round brush, I'll start off by applying a layer of greens over the mountain areas. And here I'll be using a mixture of phthalo green light with a little bit of sap green. Since this is only our first wash, so I'll be adding a little bit more water into the mixture to make it more watery. And then next, I've added a little more pigment of sap green into the mixture to give it a stronger value, and then paint that on the corners of the page. And then next, grabbing a spray bottle, just slightly moisten the top area, and then using the brush, I will drag and pull the green paints upwards to give it a nice gradual green to the distant mountains. And then here I'm slightly darkening the greens by adding a little bit more pigment to give it a nice contrast. And then next, let's grab some greenish umber, which is the darker green, to give it a darker shadow areas around the corner and bring contrast into the landscape. Let's bring some of that dark green to the shadow areas on the distant mountains. To give it a more interesting texture, I'll just add a little bit of splatters to the area. And as you can see now, I am slowly and gradually building up depth by adding more darker values into certain areas around the shadow areas. And then now let's work on the faraway mountains. Since it is furthest away in the background, I like it to be more blurry and less visible by having lots of clouds floating around. So I'm going to grab sepia with a very light wash and then just gently apply them on certain areas around the mountains. And then having the blending brush on the other hand, I'm going to blend them off just with water like so. And this will help to create the illusion of the clouds in the area. And now that the greens at the bottom has started to dry, let's add more textures by adding some water splatters into it. And then I'm going back to add more of the sepia around the distant mountains and then keep blending in with my blending brush. On areas where I like to have more softer areas, I'm going to pre-wet those small areas with water and then fill them in with the paints that will give that a nice bleeding and soft effect to the mountains. So by repeating this, we are able to create a blurry, faraway mountains where areas that are not covered in clouds are visible through the eyes. And then where areas that are covered with clouds, they will be left with paper white. And now I'll continue working on the second mountain, and to give it a little bit of variety, I've added in a little bit of brown pink into the sap green to give it a more muddy feeling. And then let's add in some sepia as well to give a variety in the texture. And if you look closely in the reference photo, there's also a small river leading out from the mountains. So I'm using French ultramarine blue to paint that in. Now that we have laid out our first layer, I'm going to start building up the second layer by adding tiny little strokes like so to depict the grass in the green fields. And then again with the blending brush, blend off the bottom area to give it a soft edge. And then feel free to give it a spray here and there to further soften the effects of these brush strokes. Going in with some of the greenish umber, I'm building up the shadows around the darker areas. Let's also have some stones lying around the grass, so I'm painting in the shape of the stones and then blurring them out to show the shadow areas. This overall landscape is pretty much very abstract, so you don't have to follow every single brush stroke I make or the placement of where my grass areas are. I'd like you to play around and apply brush strokes on areas where you see fit, on areas where you may think could do a bit more details. And everybody's work is very different, so it depends on your current painting, how does the composition look, I'd like you to adjust accordingly. If possible, take a 2-second break, stand up and look at your painting. From a further distance, you'll be able to see which areas needs more details, which areas needs more layering and such. From there, you'll be able to judge your landscape and apply colors or details at areas which you think would work best. And here I'm drawing out another stone in the corner. Going back to the darker areas around the two corners at the bottom, I've mixed in neutral tint with a little bit of greenish umber to bring in the darkest greens. And I feel like this mountain looks a little flat, so I'll be adding more textures to this area. I'm using sepia with a little bit of neutral tint to paint in the rocks and also some of the shadows on the mountains. And then let's paint some outlines of the mountains and then blend it off with the blending brush. And to make the mountains on the left less plain, I'm going to add a few more rocks into the grassy areas. Now let's work on the river. I'm going to add more ultramarine blue with a little bit of neutral tint to pin out the shadows along the corners of the river. Slowly build out more depth and contrast in the painting by darkening the shadow areas as you see fit. At this point, you'll be able to see that the painting is starting to show its form and shape with all these tiny little details that you've added in. So it's all about adding more layers and building up more textures slowly into the landscapes. Do be patient if you think that your landscape is not there yet, if it's at the ugly phase. I understand. So that is part of the phase that we all have to go through. But if you keep persisting and keep working on it, I can guarantee you that with a little bit more work and a little bit more patience, the landscape will slowly come to life. I feel that this area still looks a little bit flat, so I'm drawing in some crack lines to draw in the shadows and then give it more depth and texture to the landscapes. You can see that every now and then I'm going back to the further distance to add more depth into the areas And then coming back to the front to add more brush strokes for the grass. Right now at this phase, I am adjusting the entire landscape on areas where I see that could use more work, which is why I'm going back and forth to add more details at the front and at the back. So feel free to also do so with your painting and slowly build up more textures. Alright, so that's the end for our painting, and one last bit. Let's bring back some of the highlights into the painting, and grabbing a white ink brush, I'm going to draw in lines like so around especially the darker shadow areas that would bring back some of the highlights of the grass. Feel free to smudge the ink a little with your hands so that it doesn't turn out with a harsh edge. You could add lines like this, especially on areas where we've applied darker greens earlier, so that it will help to stand out even more. And to make the texture a little more interesting, I'm adding some dots like so, to make it look like some flower buds blooming in the grassy areas. If you have a really old ink pen that is almost running out of ink, that will be the best ink to use, because then we will have plenty of broken white lines, which looks perfect on this kind of landscapes as compared to a brand new ink pen where you get smooth lines. But otherwise, that's also fine. You can just smudge them off with your hand to break out some of the lines. And that is all for our painting today. If you're still here, thank you very much for staying until the end. If you enjoyed this video, do give it a like and subscribe to my channel for more tutorials like this. Until then, I will see you next week.